Caroline, Chair.
Thank you very much. Well, good morning, everybody. Those in the room at the Audit Committee and those who may be listening elsewhere. The first item on the agenda is apologies for absence. Eric?
Angie Beachy has provided her apologies, Chair, and I'll be covering her report.
Yes, there are no apologies for absence from members of the committee. Apology for absence for one of the report presenters later, whom Kerry will advise us about. Are there any pecuniary interests of members? Members are reminded that they must declare their disclosable pecuniary interests and other registrable or non-registrable interests. Are there any such pecuniary interests? Thank you. We now come to the minutes of the previous meetings held on the 16th of September and the 22nd of October. I've no doubt you've all perused these very carefully and have very good memories of these meetings. So would somebody propose that we accept them as a correct record? Thank you, Simon. Anybody? Nigel was it both? Yes, thank you, Nigel. Proposed and seconded and agreed, I trust. Any matters arising from those minutes? No? No members of any matters arising. Thank you. We now come to public questions, and we have received 2 public questions, which I will read out, and the responses that we have been prepared. The first 2 questions are both from Mr. Stephen Malloy. One is brief, one is a little longer. And then we have a question, a member's question. But the public questions, Mr. Malloy first of all asked, would it be possible to have an update, possibly from the external auditor, on when objectors to the Council's Statement of Accounts for 2020-21 might receive a comprehensive response from the external auditor? And the Audit Committee responds, thank you for your question. Grant Thornton, the Council's external auditors, have confirmed that due to resourcing constraints and focus on completing the 2021 financial statements audit work has not progressed as planned. The external auditor, Grant Thornton, has now commissioned a specialist resource to help review this objection and should be able to respond by Easter of this year, 2022. The second question from Mr. Malloy is, he states, Shropshire Council do not routinely check planning conditions have been discharged before recording them as discharged on the local land charges register. This is something that has been brought to the attention of the external auditor. Can I ask if the audit team have carried out an investigation into the recording of planning conditions relating to the development of the Brambles, Whitchurch SY31FE, and if not, will they do so to determine if the discharge of conditions had been correctly recorded and whether Shropshire Council has a liability under the indemnity that comes with the research certificates provided? And our response from the Audit Committee is, thank you for your question. I can confirm that internal audit have not carried out reviews into the recording of planning conditions relating to specific developments. The service is not resourced to and does not check all transactions of the Council. However, systems are reviewed following a risk-based methodology. If a member of the public has a specific concern, this can initially be raised and dealt with by the direct service area, in this case the planning department, and in the unlikely event of any dissatisfaction in respect of the response provided, there is a complaint process that can be called upon to evaluate the position, and ultimately this allows for an independent review through the Ombudsman. So that's our response there. Now, we now have a member question from Councillor Roger Evans. It's a very long question, and I think since Councillor Roger Evans is here, I'll invite him to read his own question.
Thank you, Chairman.
You've got a copy of it, right? And I will then respond to Councillor Evans. Councillor Evans, you're live.
Right. Thank you, Chairman. From the information supplied, I have concerns with what happened at a recent planning meeting. I am of the opinion it raises fundamental questions and assurances need to be given that Shropshire Council complies with and follows all appropriate regulations. A planning application was submitted by Canovi, a company wholly owned by Shropshire Council, and I give details of the application number. But note, the decision is not on whether or not the planning application should or should not be granted. That is not queried. What is queried, and the subject of this question, is whether all the regulations concerning how much affordable housing should the applicant, Canovi, be required to provide. This is especially relevant since it is a Shropshire Council wholly owned company. The regulations being queried are that under normal circumstances, this application would be required to supply 20% affordable housing, which, with the proposed scheme of 9 dwellings, would result in 1 affordable housing being provided on site and the balance of 0.8 being provided as a financial contribution towards future affordable housing. The scheme was presented to the Southern Planning Committee on the 8th of February, and in a section of the committee report, it refers to a vacant building credit, bringing the affordable housing contribution down to 0.6, which is less than 1 dwelling, and therefore just £41,094 being required from the applicant. However, it has been pointed out to me that the attached application form declares that the existing floor space for vacant building credit is just 465 square metres. The proposed floor area of the scheme is 2,280.1 square metres. The existing floor area therefore only represents 20.4% of the proposed development area. This leaves a net floor area of 1,815.1 square metres. The question asked is that under the regulations, shouldn't a reduction of affordable housing contribution be reduced by a similar amount, by just 20%? The application should then provide 1 affordable house plus 0.4 financial contribution towards future affordable housing, £27,396. The application is not submitted by a private individual, but by a company that is wholly owned by Shropshire Council, and I show below the details from the website. I wish this to be examined and a reply provided so that the public can be assured that every application, including those submitted by companies owned by Shropshire Council, are all dealt with in a similar and correct fashion with all appropriate regulations complied with. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor Evans. I have considered with the head of audit the most appropriate way to deal with this issue. Whilst it is a question around compliance with policies and processes, the service area is probably the best starting point for the inquiry, and the head of audit has therefore raised your concern with the planning service and asked that they provide an initial response to her. If there is an ongoing concern about the process followed followed, this can then be escalated through the appropriate channel, which may be an independent review by internal audit, and you will be advised on this in due course. That's the end of the formal response, but I will ask the head of audit, have you received a response yet from planning?
No, not yet, Chair.
But when it is received, you will be in contact with Councillor Evans.
Absolutely, yes.
Thank you, Chairman. There is a little bit of supplementary question information. The site, sorry, there is a little bit of supplementary question information, and it's to add to the question. The site is not a vacant site. The building, I understand, is derelict. The police have to be regularly sent for. Some parts of it have been given to the local village ward. It's been derelict for around 3 years. Some say it should be classed as an abandoned building. So
Thank you, Roger. I've been
supplementary.
very generous because we don't normally allow supplementary.
Under the Constitution, there is a supplementary to all member questions, Chairman.
Oh dear.
Okay.
Very good.
That's me.
I haven't got the
that's me
Constitution by me, but I'll accept your view.
That's me finished, Chairman. I just wanted to draw that to the attention of the audit team so that they can ask for that information to be included when they ask for information, and it can come back. Thank you for the answer.
We accept your supplementary information in the sense that it is trying to be helpful to this audit, head of audit, in responding to whatever comes back from the planning department. So that's the end of both public questions and members' questions. And we now move on to item 6, second line assurance, Treasury Strategy Mid-Year Report 21-22, which will be presented by our Director of Resources, James Walton.
Thank you, Chair. There are two papers on the agenda today around the Treasury Strategy. So this is the mid-year report for 2021, and then the next item will be the Treasury Strategy for 2022-23. It wouldn't normally come to the same meeting, but the mid-year review, which was as at the end of September, was delayed for a number of reasons around the end of the last calendar year.
Can I stop you for a moment?
Absolutely.
Director of Resources, are you taking these two reports together?
No. I will take them separately, Chair, but I just wanted to give some context around the two papers.
Thank you.
So in relation to item 6, which is the mid-year review, as I say, this should come at the end of the last calendar year, and has been delayed for a number of reasons. So it's a requirement that when the Treasury Strategy is set at the start of the 21-22 financial year, that sets out the requirements based on an understanding of the spending and capital programme as agreed by Council in the February. Then that is reviewed halfway through the year to understand, provide an update in terms of the economic forecasts of where we are. It reviews the strategy over the year and to understand whether there's been compliance with things like the potential code requirements in there and the performance indicators around that. It also provides an update in relation to any borrowing or investment, and in theory, any update on debt rescheduling, although debt rescheduling is not something that's been undertaken for a number of years due to the changes in PWB requirements around that. The only other item that I'll point out is also included in the executive summary, and that is that there will be some debt restructuring around CDL, Cornovi Development Limited. At the moment, there are a number of separate loans. Those will be consolidated into a single loan of the same value, which provides additional flexibility and simplicity around that borrowing. Overall, the return on investments has been slightly above benchmark, and in terms of borrowing, no borrowing has been undertaken, but all borrowing is at fixed rates, so there are no implications for changing base rate levels. I'll leave it there, Chair, and happy to take any questions.
Members, any questions? Nigel, come to those.
Yeah, in relation to the Kenobi development loans, several places it mentions it. You've got 14 million, 35 million and 250 million that's consolidated into one loan of just short of 50 million. Why the discrepancy, or is it that they're loans that they could have had, i.e. the 250 million, they haven't actually had that much of the loan?
So just to confirm, it's 250,000.
Oh, is it?
No, not 250 million.
That explains that.
It does right.
Have you finished?
Yes, thank you. I'm glad that was.
James, you got a response to that?
Sorry, yeah, it's 250,000. So I suppose to give a little bit of background in relation to the three loans that were undertaken. Initially a £250,000 loan was identified, which is a general loan to get the company up and running. Then a £14 million loan was identified around two specific developments, and then a revolving £35 million loan was provided. As the company got up and running and started to create and take forward these developments, a review of that, those particular loan arrangements were considered, and it was felt that it was quite complicated to hold three separate loans, all of which had different terms and requirements, and all of which required different business cases in slightly different formats to be produced for each one to satisfy the requirements of the loan agreement at that point in time. So given that the bulk of that loan was a £35 million revolving loan, it was felt that applying that approach to all of the funding would be a simpler way for the company to access the funding, and a way that a simpler way for the local authority to keep control of that loan agreement. So that's why it was pulled together in that basis.
Thank you. Rosemary, I'll come back. Nigel.
Thank you. Yeah, well, one of my questions was to ask why it was better for us or Cornobi, why it should be consolidated. Another question about the Cornobi situation was I wanted to ask, I think I've read somewhere independently of this, that these documents, that Cornobi pays something like about 6% loan interest on the loan. Is that right?
So, if I may, Chair, the loan agreements that were arranged with CDL were based on treasury requirements in relation to interest rates. As CDL is a startup company and didn't have any financial track record, then there is a formula that's applied which identifies the track record of the company, the financial risk associated with that, the level of security that can be provided around a loan, etc. And then there is an expectation that loan levels set at a rate above the base rate would then be applied based on certain circumstances. So, and that helps to avoid things like state aid issues, etc. So, as CDL is a separate company from Shropshire Council, in terms of requesting any borrowing from Shropshire Council, we have to follow that Treasury guidance. And on that basis, the rates were set. Those rates are set at the time of those loans being undertaken, but they're based on that formula. Fundamentally, because it's a startup company with no track record, it means that there's a higher risk. So just like effectively the local authority is being treated as a bank here. So in any company going to a bank without any track record, without any history, without levels of security, would it be expected to pay significantly higher rates? So to avoid state aid, we have to charge those same high rates.
May I ask?
Yes, if you've got supplementary.
Yeah, it's actually relating to the cash balances, just the item before that. I just wondered why the benchmark was set at a negative figure. I think it was 0.8%.
So, my chair, the benchmark is based on the assumptions around the country about the level of investment return that would be undertaken based on active management of your treasury balances. With the bank base rate dropping down as low as it has, down to I think it was 0.1% at one point, then actually, whereas you know, common sense would say you would normally receive interest on the basis of a cash being advanced to an organisation, many banks didn't want to hold the cash basically, so they're actually charging organisations to hold that cash on their behalf. So it actually became a negative return to invest. So the overall calculations produced around that actually produced a benchmark that then was in the negative levels. We have been able to place our investments at positive returns every time, and that has meant that we've been able to exceed the benchmark. But actually, basically, very simply, banks are charging to hold money because the base rate is so low.
You happy with that?
Yes, thank you.
I'll go back to Nigel because he put his hand up simultaneously with Rosemary, and she possibly wants to go back to his previous supplementary previous question. Or maybe he has another
It was
question.
actually the same question, but I'm not sure I received the little bit of the answer I wanted. In regard to the consolidated loan, is that still being treated with the same higher rate as the other loans, or are you now able to move away because they're not necessarily it's not necessarily a brand new company? You know? So is there a favourable loan as a result of consolidating?
So, if I may share, I'm not able to comment in relation to what the actual loan will be. What will happen is that based on the information that's available at that time, an assessment will be made. Now, given time has gone by, there is more likelihood that it will be a better rate than previously, but whether it actually will be, I can't guarantee. But also because the base rate has gone up, then that will have an impact. So even if the rate did come down slightly, it may be compensated negatively because of that loan. But I can't comment on that because until the final documentation is drawn up, and on that day, that's when the actual rate is set.
Okay,
Yeah, thank you.
Councillor Evans.
Thank you, Chairman. I think we're all on the same area of questioning, and it is about the Canopy. My understanding is originally it was per development. Now with a consolidated revolving loan, I welcome that because it would enable Canopy to keep on developing and doing what the council wishes to build as many affordable homes and homes that we can possibly do. But yeah, audit, I think we do need to ensure that the council's money is deployed correctly and efficiently. But there is a council policy that we want Canopy and affordable homes to be increased. It is an operational decision, but I would hope that inbuilt in the revolving loan, there is a process to review it as the company gets more history and the assets increase in value. The percentage that the council charges for the revolving loan is revised or reviewed annually, quarterly, whenever that is. It's an operational decision. I understand that, but I would hope that for audit we do need returns on our money and to get the best available we can, but we do also need to do something on behalf of residents of Shropshire to try and ensure we do build houses which they can afford and able to live in. So the general thrust is I welcome it, but can we be assured that the interest rate will be kept under review and kept as low as operationally we feel it should be?
If I may share, there's a number of factors to this. Bear in mind as well that lower interest rates generate high profit. High profit then creates corporation tax, and so the swings and roundabouts in relation to this. My understanding is that each time a drawdown is undertaken, that drawdown at that point in time, there is an assessment in relation to the interest rate at that point in time. So that would therefore mean that is continually being assessed. The other factor within this is that as the company builds assets and has assets on its books until it's sold, there is the opportunity to secure the loan against those assets. So by having the security against the loan, that in itself helps to reduce the interest rate that will be applied to it. So on the basis of those drawdowns and that improved asset base, the expectation would be that those interest rates would fall over a period of time, but it will be based on the conditions at that point in time.
Councillor Harris.
Yeah, can I ask, when going forward, will Kenobi attempt to borrow commercially, or will it always, do you know if it will always be looking at borrowing at what I perceive to be favourable rates from the council?
There is no requirement for CDL to borrow from the local authority. So if it wishes to go out to the market and borrow at better rates from the commercial market, it can do that. The rates that we are applying, we would argue are not favourable rates. They are the rates that would be applicable to any organisation that would be making a request on the basis of those loans. But certainly there is no requirement for Kenobi CDL to borrow from the local authority, and in the same vein, there is no requirement for the council to lend money to CDL. It's all based on whether that is appropriate for both sides.
Yes, thank you. So, yeah, I would just be interested to know what the commercial rate would be, and whether it's favourable at 6% or whether it's not. Anyway, thank you. May I ask a second question? On page 24, I think I asked this one once before. Would you like to comment on the number of other local authorities that the council invests in? I know that they are rated appropriately, but I think experience tells us that the rating agencies can often be quite a long way behind the curve, and given what we're going to find out at full council with our own budgeting stresses, I just wonder how many of these other local authorities that we are investing in may have equal problems over the next 5 years or so, and thus should we invest in them? That's the thrust of my question. Thank you, sir.
Through you, Chair. There's a few factors at play here. I think the fundamental one probably is that local authorities by statute cannot go bust. So there is a government, a presumed government backing in relation to any local authority and their cash position. So from that point of view, as it's always, the golden rule is return of your money as opposed to return on your money. We will always get our money back from local authorities the way that is considered, because it's fundamentally government-backed debt or borrowing. The other factor within this is that local authorities may struggle in relation to their budget setting, but there's a totally separate consideration in relation to their cash position. So these local authorities are rated on the basis of their cash position as opposed to their fundamental budgeting. So in the same way that Shropshire Council, as I set out in this report, while we would make the point that we have a structural deficit, that we are struggling to balance the books from a budgetary point of view, we also have £160 million in the bank at any one point in time. So to borrow and lend is a completely separate consideration to the overarching budget position, and that cash position is assessed by the rating agencies, and because it's government backed, it's low risk on the back of that. Nevertheless, we will still make local decisions if we feel that we have intelligence that suggests that we would not want to place with a particular local authority for whatever reason. But we generally will stick with the rating agency information on that basis.
Thank you. I mean, the problem with cash in the bank is it's here today and gone tomorrow.
It will not have escaped your notice, Simon, that all those to whom we lend money are rated no lower than A- on the, this is on the current investment list on the page you referred to, rated no lower than A-, which means that their credit rating is pretty good, and many of them are AA. So we're certainly
No, I really would object to that, but
I'm sure
thank you,
well,
thank you, sir.
you won't get the opportunity.
Best to move on. Thank you.
Okay, anything else? Will somebody, shall we all agree to accept the report? Thank you very much indeed. Now, we now move to item 7. Second line assurance, the Treasury strategy for 22-23, which starts on page 43 of the report. Treasury strategy. James?
Thank you, Chair. So after reviewing the mid-year strategy for 21-22, the year that we are just coming to the end of now, this paper then looks forward to the Treasury strategy for 2022-23. So this was approved by Cabinet last week, comes through to Audit Committee today, and will go on to full council for approval Thursday later this week. So the recommendations set out on page 3 of the report, page 45 of the pack. There are 3 sets of recommendations there, just for openness and clarity. So there's the recommendations to Cabinet, there's a single recommendation then to Audit Committee, and then it demonstrates what those recommendations are to full council. As has been discussed previously, Audit Committee is the committee of the council that is charged with the responsibility for consideration and review of the Treasury strategy. So this is the opportunity for members to question and consider any issues they have within that strategy is set out. We produce the council's medium-term financial strategy and the capital strategy, and it's from those and assumptions around borrowing and investment rates that we will then pull together a treasury strategy, which effectively sets out the way in which we are going to manage the council's cash over the next 12 months, based on a set of assumptions and based on a series of policies and requirements, such as the minimum revenue provision policy and a set of potential indicators which are set out. There's an update in relation to the interest rate forecasts over a period, and there are assumptions then built in around any borrowing that may be required over the next year, and that borrowing then would be undertaken within the strategy as set out in the paper. Last year, the Treasury strategy did assume that there would be some borrowing on the basis that there would be development of the capital programme that would require it. That borrowing was not actually undertaken due to slippage fundamentally in the capital programme. Again, there were assumptions around borrowing built into this strategy. The other thing to state, is that those borrowing assumptions are based around a kind of a worst case scenario, if I put it that way, in relation to the capital strategy. So where there are assumptions around projects being taken forward, there's an assumption that that funding will be spent, and while there may be presumptions around generating external funding or generating capital receipts or using grants or other forms of external funding to pay for a proportion of that, the Treasury strategy assumes that there will be borrowing, so that if there is a requirement to do that and there is an affordability element that enables that to be undertaken, the Treasury strategy will enable that to happen. It doesn't, however, require any of that borrowing to be undertaken. It merely sets the envelope around that worst case scenario. I'll stop at that point, but happy to take any questions.
Right, we'll go to Nigel first, and then I'll come to Roger. Councillor Lumley.
Yes, at 12.2, it links to base rate, and the report sort of says March 0.25, June 0.5, and March 23 0.75. Obviously, history has overtook that, where we've got a base rate now of 0.5 with a high expectation of 0.75 and at least 1 by the end of the year. I do recognise that on page 72 it says felt base rates will incrementally increase in 2022. I just seek reassurance that if the base rate is whizzing up, that the lending strategy is there to keep up.
James?
Yep, certainly. So yeah, the rates that are quoted in here are as at the end of December 2021. They do change. To be honest, those rates change twice a day, every day. So in relation to what they will be at any point in time, it's based on those decisions they're taking at the time that they're taking. In terms of our exposure, there's three parts to this. In relation to the existing borrowing that we have, a change in base rate has no impact whatsoever because everything we take is fixed, and we do that on purpose. Obviously, a lot of those rates were fixed before interest rates fell considerably, and therefore there would have been a benefit to borrow at those low rates. However, it also obviously guards against significant increases. In terms of investment rates, an increase in the base rate would therefore enable us to receive greater levels of investment return. That's built into some of those longer term rates now, but we're starting to see that upturn. And we would expect therefore additional income from investments to be in the hundreds of thousands over the year on the basis of those base rate increases. The third factor then is around future borrowing. Rises in the base rate would therefore increase the cost of that borrowing. That is, there's an element of this is it will be what it will be. At any point that we need to borrow, we will consider what that requirement is and what the rate is at that point in time. The things to bear in mind are pricing in of those base rate increases. So over a period of time now, we've seen slightly increased rates as that's been priced into the market. So we wouldn't expect to see a sudden jump in those borrowing requirements. The amount of time that funding is borrowed over will have potentially a significant impact on those rates. And whenever we do borrow, we borrow based on our existing borrowing policy and thresholds. So in other words, if we say you needed to borrow £10 million, we wouldn't necessarily borrow that £10 million with an asset life of 40 years, over 20 years or 40 years. We might actually say, well, actually, we'll borrow that £10 million, 5 million that will mature in 15 years' time, and 5 million that will mature in 25 years' time, simply because that impacts much better on our repayment profile, so we can keep that under control. So we don't borrow purely for the purposes of assets or capital program being developed. It's based on the cash flow requirements over that period of time. And the reality is, taking into account Councillor Harris's point around cash can come and go, we do have high cash balances at the moment. So things that are being undertaken in the short term, it's unlikely that we would borrow in the short term. We would rather use reduce those cash balances down and then borrow at an appropriate point in the future. So it may well be that you wouldn't borrow for another 12 months, even though the cost has been undertaken in this financial year. If that makes sense. It's a separate argument in relation to the treasury management as opposed to the spending profile.
Yes, it's a supplementary, Nigel. Yes.
The reason why I bring it up in 15.1, where the report mentions borrowing in advance of need, I accept that the report says you don't want to do it, but if interest rates are going up and up and up and up, is there a thought of securing a low interest rate to preempt the future? I know you talked about we'll do it to existing,
yeah,
but maybe you need to be thinking of in a year's time when interest rates are 5, 6, 7%, you might have borrowed for future needs.
Yeah. So there's a couple of points in there. Borrowing in advance of need, we can't do. So there's treasury requirements around that. So unless we can demonstrate that we need to borrow the money, you can't just borrow that money and pile it off. The other point is, and I've said this for God, probably like 5, 6, 7 years now, and I always start with, and I will get this wrong. I will get this wrong. However, 7 years ago, this would be, certainly 5 years ago, there was discussions about we need to borrow now because interest rates are low. Had we borrowed £20 million. Instead of having £160 million in the bank, now we'd have £180 million in the bank, and we'd be paying interest on that and earning 0.14% on that return. So unless we need that money, you don't go out and take out a mortgage just because interest rates are low and then go, and then I'll think about when I spend it in 5 years' time. It's really about, let's understand what it is we want to do, and then at the point at which we need that money, that's when you make a decision around how you finance that. And certainly, interest rates are low, absolutely. I can see the temptation, and it is something that we're considering continually, but we work with our treasury advisors, and at the moment, their strong advice is with our cash balances and the situation is, and those long-term rates, if you look at those long-term rates, they're not going up significantly over the next sort of 2 to 3 years. Why would you borrow now at this point in time? So, but we do keep it under consideration.
Thank you, James. I'm getting to Roger next, and I'll come to you, Simon.
Thank you, Chairman. Noting the report on page 51 in 8.6, it says statutory right under section 33 of the Local Government Act, etc., means that increases in capital expenditure must be limited to a level whereby increases in charges to the revenue from increases in interest charges, running costs, etc., are limited to a level which is affordable within the projected income of the council for the foreseeable future. Another report, which isn't before us today, but it predicts that the council will need to be looking at borrowing quite a large sum of money over the next few years, depending on what you just said a few minutes ago. But there will be repayments which will need to be charged against a revenue account, and it is being predicted elsewhere that council is putting a balanced budget together for next year, but the following years it is the risk cannot be quantified at present. A balanced budget is in the questionable area, if I can use that phrase, but there is thought that we may be borrowing money this financial year, which will need to and be added to the revenue expenditure in 23-24. Looking at that section there, as the 151 officer, are you content that if we do borrow, then it will not throw the council into jeopardy in its revenue account in the following years, given that sentence which is in the report?
Yeah. So, if I may, Chair, it's a balancing act, absolutely. So, if you take the completely risk-averse approach, then you would say we've got a 1-year settlement. We don't know what the figures are going to be for 23-24. Therefore, we cannot set a budget for 23-24 because we don't know what the levels of funding will be at that point in time. The requirements that have been set out by SIPFA in relation to the Prudential Code and in relation to the capital financing, the capital strategy, are that you are clear and quantify what those requirements are and you set those out. Now, we've set those out on the basis of a capital strategy. The original calculations around the capital strategy, the original capital strategy that's put together suggested borrowing in the order of 15 to 16 million pounds by 4, 5, 6 years' time. That was considered, I certainly considered that level to be unaffordable based on that. So the capital programme was reduced down, and now we're looking at a cost of borrowing, debt charges, in the order of £45 million being built up over the next 4 to 5 years. So what we will do is keep a constant review of that. So as we set the budget for each year, we will take that into account. So that may mean that the capital strategy would need to be revised, for example, if there were if it was considered to be unaffordable in future years. Given that we have that uncertainty about the years. Apart from next year, we've got no certainty over what this budget would look like. If we didn't build that into our capital strategy and into our medium-term financial plan, we would literally have to stop the capital programme. So we have to keep these things in balance. The reality is those are the requirements, and we need to keep that. We need to keep it, as it says, limited to a level which is affordable with an objective income for the council for the foreseeable future. We don't know what the income for the council is for the foreseeable future, because we don't know that we haven't got sight of government funding from 23-24 onwards. That is not saying therefore we cannot undertake any borrowing over that period. It means that we need to keep it under continual assessment. So I'm satisfied that we are we're keeping these things in balance, and we're keeping them under review. Ultimately, there is that veto there. If it becomes unaffordable, we have to stop the programme.
Thank you for that, James. Councillor Harris, Simon?
Yes, thank you. Well, I'm pleased to hear that you're not borrowing long-term and investing short-term, which is what was the possibility, because that often ends in tears. Quick question: do you hedge interest rates?
We don't hedge interest rates.
Okay. Just a more general sort of, if you like, a helicopter question is a lot of detail on prudential indicators and on the minimum reserve position. Would it be possible, James, maybe next time we look at this, that there is a slide which basically shows us whether we are compliant? I mean, from an audit committee perspective, it's quite a heavy read, that. It was for me anyway. Maybe that's my limitations, but to know what a prudential indicator is and how all that works. But having stepped back, I just wondered, well, are we compliant? And at this level, if I could ask, it would be really helpful if there is a slide which says we're compliant or not, or where we've gone. Thanks. Sorry.
If I may, Chair, we are completely compliant. We are fully compliant with the retention indicators, and to be fair, I should have said that in my introduction. That's a given that we will ensure that we are compliant. So all of those indicators as set out are that there's a requirement that they're set out in that format, so that it can be considered, scrutinised, reviewed by the committee charged with that to that level of detail. I accept that they're not particularly user friendly, and if I'm completely honest with the committee, when somebody says I've got a question about potential indicator X, I start to come out in a cold sweat, because they are really quite complex in relation to what those indicators are and what those different requirements are. So if anybody does have any questions about any specific performance indicators and the potential code, I'd ask that you send them in advance so I can get our Treasury Manager to provide you the answer rather than me trying to do it here and now. In terms of providing just an oversight to say, this is the way it works, and this is that we are compliant with that overall suite. Certainly, we can look to introduce something into the report that just confirms that.
I mean, it's compliant, and how close are we to the non-compliant, that sort of space that I'd be. I just find that useful. So not the detail.
A red, amber, green in terms of are we getting closer to it or whatever, those sorts of things. We can certainly look at that.
Because at least at that stage, if we can see that as a audit committee, we can know easily whether it's getting worse or we're in a really good space. So I'll leave it there. Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir. When the section 151 officer said, I'm going to be completely honest with the committee, I raise my eyebrows because I assume that you're always completely honest with the committee, James.
That's another given.
Like the unfortunate phrase. No, we've all given appropriate comment as we are asked to do. Shall we now endorse the Treasury strategy from 2022-2023? All in favour? Thank you very much indeed. Now we come to item 8, which is the second line assurance, strategic risk update. Now I understand Angela Beachy, our risk manager, is heavily involved with risks involved with flooding and with the current gales that have been blowing around. So she's got the wind up and is not, in fact, able to give us her report today, but I understand that she has nominated somebody to take us through this report. Kerry?
Yes, thank you, Chair. So I'll do my best, but any detailed questions I might have to bring back to members. So the report sets out the current strategic risk exposure, and these have been recently reviewed in December 2021. Members, go to page 107, that's the table, and that shows you the 16 strategic risks. Key things to note on the table, we've split the cyber attack and the ICT infrastructure reliance risks. This is to recognise the increased attention we're having to give to cyber attack risks. There's widening attacks due to multiple hosted cloud systems that we have as an authority, extended home working, and in reflection of that as well, the ICT infrastructure, we rely extremely heavily on the infrastructure, and again this is increased with home working following COVID and our continuance of that way of working going forward. So it was recognised that these two stand alone on their own. You'll have noticed that the economic impact of Brexit has been removed from that list as well. Whilst there are still areas of concern following this, they'll be picked up in the economic growth strategy. And the other key thing to highlight just at this point in time is the strategic vision and strategy. The risks around this are being fully reviewed currently as executive directors, chief exec and members are talking about that during February workshops. Top of page 109 shows you the pie chart and the splits across the different risk levels, and you can see that there's only one risk below our tolerance level at the moment, and that's to do with dolls. So if there are any detailed questions behind these, there are full working papers. These identify actions and activities to keep those risks maintained or to improve the direction of travel, bring those risks down where possible, and they're all managed on a regular basis by executive directors and the chief exec. So there are full systems and processes behind these, and later on in the agenda we report on the strength of that risk process. Thank you, Chair.
Yes, Rosemary.
Thank you.
Don.
Thank you. I just was very interested in the reduction of the impact of Brexit from a level 4 risk straight to the archive, which I don't know, that just seems remarkable to me, given that we're only just out of the interim period. I know that, you know, I have read the reasons why, which are very scant, but I suspect that's a bit, it feels very hasty to me.
But what sits below the strategic risks are a number of operational risks and project risks, and there'll still be recognition of the impact of Brexit as well in those operational risks, where it's key to those aspects of the council's business. So it's not archived and forgotten, it's still considered and worked through there. It was just a general decision that it wasn't at that strategic level in that purest form. It was now filtering into specific areas. So any impact from Brexit where it starts to hit operational business is accounted for there. I don't know whether there's anything further, James, if you've got any further detail on that.
I think, if I may share, the consideration of it's whether there was a risk from Brexit or whether Brexit suggested a set of risks that could come about. What would those be? What would be the impact on the supply chain, for example, in relation to the various goods and services that we purchase as a local authority? What the impact on the local market? What are the impacts in relation to employment levels, etc., etc. So there are a number of those individual drivers have all been considered, and as Kerry said, there are operational risk plans and there are project risk plans around managing each of those. So was there therefore a requirement at a strategic level for the authority to continue to recognise the risk of Brexit per se as a risk, and it felt that as a heading, that as an overview, was unnecessary from that point of view, and the underlying risks behind that were all being considered and managed. Any one of those could then rise themselves up again to a strategic risk at some point in the future, because that's kept under assessment. But we just felt that it was inappropriate to keep that particular risk in place based on that heading.
Brexit, the risk that cannot bear its name. Councillor Roger Evans, Councillor Evans.
Thank you, Chairman. Again, two of a general nature. Echo Rosemary's about archiving it and not just lowering the risk. Listening to the news about Northern Ireland and the ports and the problems that are there, and what the council is planning, hoping, expecting to do in the next few years. I would have thought there is maybe a little bit of a risk there for some of the projects that are being considered in other places, in other papers. So lower it, but keep it there would be my thoughts. And then finally, I note the 7.8, the comment there about the executive directors meeting later this month to update and consider it. Is there anything there that we need to be aware of, either as an exempt paper, exempt comment, or whatever? But it seems to be a little bit strange that there is some disagreement, I would assume, in it, and it's just to be examine it there. So it's that comment that appears in 7.8 in the report.
Can I just ask, following that, how often do we have the strategic risk workshop of the executive directors?
Okay, so I take both those two bits together. So there's a couple of things here. The executive directors meet on a weekly basis, and it's now become custom and practice that one of the strategic risks is considered at each of those weekly meetings. So we're just basically working our way through the list, and when we get to the end, we go back to the start. So we're constantly keeping those strategic risks under review, and we have a series of challenges that we ask the group in relation to: is the risk still valid? Is the scoring still appropriate? Does it fall within or outside of our risk appetite? Are the existing controls and additional controls appropriate? And ultimately, it's just that kind of horizon scan that kind of says, will we ever get to a point where this risk will be managed, or what would actually be required to kind of take this strategic risk away? And it was that kind of challenge that led us to the archiving of Brexit, because so there wasn't a specific risk there. And going back to Councillor Evans' point, absolutely it has impacts on lots and lots of different projects still. And it's still reflected in those projects. It's whether it was an overview that was necessary in relation to that. In relation to that specific point around 7.8, annually we will have a challenge session, a strategic risk workshop. So at that point, we will then go through each of the risks, the whole table that's set out there in 7.4, and we will go through and we will do two things. One is we will review those overarching risks and the existing scores within those to see whether we are comfortable with that position, because we're now reviewing them every week as well. That means that's less of an onerous task. And what we then do is look at the target score that we would be looking to achieve by the end of the year. So this may mean that we can do something about the impact, but what we can't do is don't have any controls over the likelihood, or vice versa, or we might be able to do something about both, and we might not be able to do anything about both. But we will consider those against our risk appetite and review that overall process. So there's nothing unusual about 7.8. It's an annual process that we undertake, and following that workshop, that would then be reported through to Cabinet, so that they have sight of those strategic risks and scores associated with those, and they will have an opportunity then to feed into that process. And then we will start the process then about reviewing those weekly, again, executive directors, and feeding that into the audit committee side of business.
Okay. Nigel, Councillor Lumby.
I've read most of all what we've dealing with today, and I have to say this matrix of likelihood and impact absolutely shone out at me and worried me as to some of the likelihoods that have been chosen, which I wouldn't have thought had got those numbers. I am reassured in part by what James says about how they're reviewed so often and the workshops they have, but I have not got reassurance today that these likelihoods that I see in front of me, from my experience, are just credible. So I personally would need on this committee more assurance that the likelihood impact are correct and that there's actually an understanding of the use of it. Just for examples, why likelihood for adult funding and child services should both be 5s as likelihoods. I get it that each year, if the budget isn't right, and I think this might be influenced by the fact that 85% of the spending of the council is in those areas, so that has to be a significant risk. I just wonder if some of these likelihoods have been configured to make sure that they're in your strategic risk. So I'm not really assured on that. Things like climate change at 4 and 4. I don't see how the likelihood of that is so high to have an impact immediately. You can say, yes, well, we have flooding, and so that is an issue, but as a strategic risk, I just don't see how some of these figures should be high. Failure to manage and mitigate the mental health and well-being of staff, a 5. When we talk 5, these are incredibly likely. They're more likely than unlikely. So that's the norm. I appreciate then that you put your mitigation in place, but there comes a point when actually your general running should be what forms your likelihood, and then it's additional mitigations that actually bring it down. And I'm not sure these have necessarily been assessed along that line. It's like as though can we run adult and social care? What's the risk of that vulnerability? Oh, well, if we do absolutely nothing, it's a 5. Well, that's not. You've got all the controls in place already. That's your standard. Sorry, I'm going on.
Yeah, no. If I may, Chair, I absolutely welcome the challenge, and this is something that we constantly need to look at and consider and review. So, if I take that example of the ability to fund adult services, what we are saying is that, in terms of the likelihood, do we have enough funding to fund adult services? And the answer is categorically no, we don't. What we do to support that is we shift funding from other parts of the council so that we don't put adults and children's into safeguarding issues. So we have overspends in those areas, and we have funding savings taken from other parts of the council to fund that. So what we used to have was a risk around adult services, and we kind of looked at that and challenged that and said, do we honestly believe that we are putting adults at risk as a result of the finances? And the honest answer was no, we weren't. What we were doing is we would shovel money from other places of the authority to ensure that the risk associated with safeguarding adults didn't occur. But the reality behind that was that there is no escaping that right now we do not have enough money to fund adult social care. So it's a bit of a strange one because we do, but we don't. So we're managing that risk by shoveling money elsewhere, but the risk is fundamental and is absolutely happening now, which is why it's been scored at a 5. So, and the other thing to bear in mind is that this is a risk assessment as opposed to an assessment of reality. So these are the things that are absolutely at the top of our list for consideration. So the things that are scored 5.5 and 5.4 and 5.3, etc., are the things that should be right at the top of the consideration of the local authority and are being managed on a daily basis. And the reality is that each of those ones that are scored high are there. So there is a philosophical discussion to be had about the application of those particular scores and whether they are right or wrong. And as I say, absolutely welcome the challenge on that, because part of me totally agrees with what you're saying. This isn't quite right in terms of what this is saying. There's another part of me that's saying, but as long as the reality is that what this results in is that the highest risk issues are fleshed out, those are able to be discussed, and on a day-to-day basis, additional controls and current controls are put in place to try and manage those, then it's doing the right job at the end of it. So there are lots of examples of that across the board, and the headlines, the risk that's identified here sometimes isn't overly helpful in relation to some of the kind of the descriptors that fall then below that then demonstrate why some of those scores are there. And I personally think some of those descriptors actually should be the risk as opposed to the way it's described at the moment. So it's very easy, going back to the Brexit one as an example, it's quite easy to say that's clearly a risk, but actually the drivers that are behind it are the actual parts that are more important in relation to that. We will, I will take on board those points, and we will build that into that risk workshop review that's being undertaken next, because I do agree with you, there are parts of this that be considered. But the fundamental message is, just to reiterate, these are not things that are wrong. That ability to fund adult services, we are finding ways of funding that. We're not putting adults or children in danger. This is not, as a public message, this is about understanding the risks for the authority and demonstrating that we are managing them. Just because something is scored as a 5/5 doesn't mean we're not managing that risk. It means that we're managing it in a way that we would rather be do something different to actually reduce that risk, as opposed to reduce the actual outcomes of that. Doesn't really make sense in what I said there, but what I'm trying to say is it's a risk, it's not reality.
To my mind, it is always better to overstate a risk than to underestimate it. If we're going to err, I'd rather err on the side of caution. But thank you, James. Rosemary.
Thank you. Just following on from sticking on the same subject, I mean, these we're looking for the next year, aren't we? This is just the next year. I'm sure we all know about the Barnett graph of doom. An ever larger cake spent on adult social care particularly, but probably children's as well, given the current pandemic and the pandemic parts behind us that have brought about somewhat of a crisis in those areas. So an ever larger need for care, and from an ever smaller cake is the situation that we're in. So really the risk there is huge in the longer term, but I totally take on board what you're saying, James, about the risk being managed, and being aware of it, I suppose, is the first step, isn't it, really? I do, looking at the general responses to risk and looking at risk owners, I wonder if there's some sort of dichotomy there as well about the risk owners and their approach to risk. For example, Councillor Lumby mentioned climate change, and seeing that wasn't really a great risk. I would disagree entirely and say that is a risk. It may not be an immediate risk, but it's a risk that probably even eclipses all of the others in the longer term. So perhaps if we were looking beyond this year, it's something that is extremely serious. But given all of that, given that background of an ever diminishing fund coming to us and an ever greater demand on it, and that sort of magnetic pull of our money going towards social care, how can we have risk-free of the ability and the prediction of what we're looking at this financial year? How can we have a 3 level for the current year to deliver a balanced budget? It doesn't make sense to me. Am I reading that wrong?
Inability to deliver a balanced budget,
Yeah.
likelihood 5, impact 3. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
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 So again, if I check my chair, so this was the score that was. We basically tried to build a formula around. So again, it goes down to the kind of the level below this. We looked. The risk was originally stated around the inability to deliver a sustainable budget. And the problem with that is that the likelihood was always going to be a 5. But the reality was that because we couldn't set a sustainable budget. But what do you mean by a sustainable budget? So if you look 5 years into the future and go, it's, in 5 years' time, we've got a funding gap of £1 million. We haven't got a sustainable budget because we've got a funding gap in 5 years' time. But therefore, your likelihood is 5 because we've recognised it. And so we changed it instead and said this is an inability to deliver a balanced budget. So when these last scores were reviewed, and that one hasn't been reviewed recently, so it would have been towards the end of it would have been autumn 2021 when that score was produced. The likelihood of being able to produce a balanced budget was right in front of us. It was there. We haven't got any information from government. We were going through a process of trying to produce we were going through the budget challenge process to identify it. So the likelihood of being able to being unable to set a balanced budget at that point was very high. The impact, however, was the bit that we were working on. So what we were trying to do is we were saying, well, you know what, we've got financial strategy reserve, we've got other reserves in place, we've got ways in which we can stop this becoming a catastrophe, but have we technically got a balanced budget? No. So what we then do is, as we work through that, we're now able to set a balanced budget for 22-23. That's a very short-term measure, but can we set a balanced budget for 22-23? Yes, we can. So the likelihood now has gone down from a 5. So if I scored it today, I would say, actually, there's no risk because we've set a balanced budget for 22-23. That's a better way of keeping control of it than trying to set a risk around a sustainable budget, because the reality is we're not getting multi-year settlements from the government, so we're never going to be able to set that longer term position. And then what we did was, as part of that, we then focused on the ability to fund adult and children's services, because those were the statutory areas that we were looking for there to be an implication on. So we're setting the overall budget and we're focusing the risk around those particular areas around adults and children. And we will continue to review that on so as we go into 22-23 and we're setting the budget for 23-24, right now for 23-24, we have a likelihood of a 5 because we're unable to set that at this point in time.
I'm sure Angela Beachy would feel that she's been under far less stress dealing with flood and wind than facing this committee to defend her report. Shall we agree to accept the report, members?
No.
Nigel
I want
votes.
to abstain, please.
Sorry?
I want to abstain, then.
You're abstaining, right. The clerk will note that Councillor Lumbey abstained. Other members agreed to support.
Thinking about it, Chairman, I think I'll abstain as well, because I do take into consideration some of the comments that Nigel made.
I think
I'm not against it, but I feel that given the comments there, to abstain.
Right, well, in that case, I think I'm going to ask for a show of hands. Those in favour of the report?
Can I make a
Yes.
Actually, I think what I was after was reassurance that the matrix was correct. I accept that what you're trying to achieve is to cover all your strategic risks. I'm just not sure that it's being applied to this. So I want something to come back to me to reassure me that it's been reviewed and that they are correct about why they're correct. So I don't know whether we can ask that as an audit committee, that we seek that reassurance.
If I may, Chair, if I come in this point, if Angela Beachy were here, she would provide you with that assurance. Unfortunately, what we need is the risk management, because I'm talking about the risks. What I'm not talking about is the risk management process, and that's really what your concern is here. I think you need Angie in the room who will take you through the process by which we assess these risks, the matrix that we use, the individual scoring and the descriptors against each of those areas against which it's assessed, and then the process that we go through. And she'll be able to provide you, well, she'll provide you with assurance. Then there's a question about whether you accept that. But I'm fully accepting that you probably want Angie in the room to do that.
Well, can I suggest that we accept the report today and request that Angie attends the next meeting and provides us with an updated, it's only a 5-page report, so it's not going to be too much of a trouble for her to produce another similar report, but updated to the time of our next meeting.
If I may, Chair, I think what Nigel quite rightly is bringing to our attention how this report is put together, and I think it's quite right to do so, because I know that's your background, Nigel. You look at this sort of the way these strategic risks and the likelihood and the impact of them. And can I suggest that we accept this report because it is what it is, under the structure today, and can I suggest that at the next meeting that, as you say, that Angela comes, or one of the officers comes and explains to us, and I think it's going to have to be fairly robustly, why likelihood is 5 and impact is 5, how those the likelihood impact that are derived, and also to Councillor Dartnell's point, how the risks are also derived, because we could sit around here and strategise, and I've no doubt pull up another 25 risks. I mean, we've all done this.
We're not going to do that.
I'm not suggesting we do for a moment, Brian, but I do think there is a need for comfort, from what Councillor Dartnell was saying, that once we've accepted this one, going forward, we need a lot more to get our heads around this.
Well, we will. I suggest we accept the report as it is today, as you have stated, as well as myself, and all your comments will no doubt be conveyed to Angela Beachy by James and Kerry before she prepares her report, which we are going to request for our next meeting.
Kerry did want to just come in on one point.
Yeah, if I may, Chair, I can assure members that the processes around risk management achieve good assurance. All the processes are in place. There is a report later on on this agenda about the risk management process. So the process is fine. What we're challenging is the detail, and those detailed spreadsheets can be shared, and that report can come. We could also do that as a training session. The June committee is quite a heavy committee, so it may be that the training session before that committee is a good one, because then you can get into that level of detail that may not be appropriate given the time you'll have at a public meeting. It's just a thought, Chair.
Well, I think that sounds a good idea to put it on as a. Members obviously want to understand the thinking behind each risk in terms of its likelihood and the rating of the likelihood and impact. So probably that is a better suggestion. We've got another training session before June, haven't we?
Yes, Chairman.
Well, let's do that. I still feel that we ought to have another report from Angie at the June meeting in the light of what members have said. But in order to get a better understanding of how she's preparing the report, we'll put it on as a training session. Nigel?
Yeah, what Kerry refers to is like Appendix A, which is the work plan later on, and at 16 is strategic risk, and it says good risk management system. If I'm uncomfortable and unhappy with how the matrix gets to that in the first place, I've got a problem with how that appendix can come up with a good risk management system. So I'm still not reassured. I appreciate that all that the work behind is being done and all the risks are being managed. I'm just uncomfortable with this. Well, so I still can't support this report today. So I think that's how we move on. And we've got to make a decision. And I think the suggestion of Kerry that we have a training session on this is a good one. So I invite members to agree that and to accept the report as we have received today.
Mayor,
Yeah, come
just
on.
before you invite us to vote, can I just ask, perhaps for that training session, if this is Councillor Lumley's area of expertise and with the questions that we've asked, perhaps we could ask those questions in advance of the training session, so Angela can prepare those in some way, or address those
Certainly.
in far more detail than perhaps she might do otherwise.
At any training session, we're always glad to have concerns by members expressed that they would wish to discuss and see answered at a training session. So, Nigel, we would very greatly welcome, I'm sure Angie will, a pre-warning of what you would hope she could reassure her on. So certainly that will be done. James and Kerry will brief Angie on what we're expecting from our training session. Can we perhaps, in order to make progress, accept that some of us accept the report? See it 2, 3. Against? Abstentions? Our committee clerk will have noted the extensions and the fact that the report is carried by 3 votes to 0 on this occasion. Right, I think we'll do one more report and then we'll have a comfort break. So we've now come to the Head of Audit report, report 9 on page 111, second line assurance, annual review of counter-fraud, bribery and anti-corruption strategy.
Thank you, Chair. This report gives members information on where we get assurances from across the council on how we're managing the risks and preventing fraud and other occurrences. So, in short, there's a number of areas that we look at. We have a very clear counter-fraud, bribery and anti-corruption strategy. We review and refresh this annually, and that's attached to this report. We look at the wider information out there as well. There's CIFAS, the Fraud Prevention Service, and we look at the fraudulent information and cases that they identify and the types of fraud that they're aware of. We consider these frauds and how they might impact on the organisation, whether we're doing enough to prevent those frauds in terms of internal controls, awareness, training. Also, there's the fighting fraud and corruption locally. And whilst this is a strategy in 2020, it's still relevant to the current times. And we ensure that we're following best practice against that strategy. And in 811, members will see that there's an action plan there and the types of activity that is ongoing against those key headline actions. And there's further detail beneath that. Also, CIPFA asks us to do a fraud and corruption survey each year. They put that on hold during COVID, but we actually got the results of the previous year's survey. And again, that highlights the values of the fraud that's average, but also the areas. So they're seeing council tax fraud and disabled parking concessions and housing fraud still as the key areas within a local government setting. All this information is used to not just drive the internal audit report, but also what we do as an organisation is shared with colleagues across the organisation to improve preventative management of these. We also had International Fraud Awareness Week, and we advertise the fact that there's whistleblowing policies, there's places that you can go if you're not comfortable and you think something's not working right, and how important it is to get things done right in the first place, not just to reduce waste, but to avoid fraudulent behaviour. And we annually complete an assessment tool, again aimed at seeing where our strengths and weaknesses are in terms of managing and preventing fraud. National Fraud Initiative, we share data sets and they send back any information that mismatches, and we analyse that, and there's details in terms of the investigations and the impact that has on the organisation. And also we report transparently on the webs in terms of the fraud data that comes to our attention. And you'll be aware through the reports you get that we have compliance with RIPA policies, responsible officers, clear go-to people, and ways that we can have support for those through bodies such as snapping. Whistleblowing policy I've mentioned, and Audit Committee get a full report in June on the impact of that and the reports that we've had under whistleblowing to see how that works effectively. And we have anti-money laundering procedures in place, and again, this is good news for us that they're in place, people know where to go to, they're trained appropriately. Corporately, an organised crime checklist is applied, so there's quite a few self-assessment tools corporately, and this is another one of those. And again, it identifies any areas of improvement that we can make and ensures that we've got those initiatives in place. So in a nutshell, this report is very much to give you those initiatives, activities, processes that are in place to keep challenging and making sure that we're addressing fraud as much as you can. You can never say it's totally wiped out, as we'll all be aware of, but it's how you manage those processes. And so I welcome any questions on those, that approach to counter fraud that we take.
So you are welcome for any questions. Have we any questions? Oh dear. Just one point of clarification I would like, Kerry. On page 119, at the top, fourth bullet point, no recourse to public funds stroke welfare assistance. What does that actually mean?
This is where you have controls in place to make sure that people that are not entitled to welfare and funds, that they don't have that access to those funds if they're not entitled to it. So if somebody's not entitled to benefits, we make sure that they've got no recourse, they can't have those public funds. They're not illegally getting access to those funds.
Right, I see. This is what's the bullet points, a rather brief summary of what it actually means.
Yeah.
Yes, it's claimants not entitled should have no recourse to public funds. I see. I understand that now. Thank you. Oh, Nigel, what have I done? I provoked you.
Kerry, in your report at 818, you've got the national reporting that they didn't identify notifiable, nothing emerged as major types of fraud. However, they then go on to list the two highest, or a number of highest, the two highest being procurement and council tax SPT. Now at 8.40, if they're saying they're the two highest, I noticed in your list of risks that you haven't got either of them identified as your highest risk, and you've got council tax discounts identified as a medium risk about halfway down, and no audit plan regarding procurement. However, I do identify that in item 17 in your audit annual plan that you have got procurement, commissioning and contract management, that you will give it as a priority area. If that's the case, if it's a priority area, how is it not identified as a risk in that 8.4?
They're identified as nationally as potential risks, absolutely. When we look at our fraud risks and plans, so for instance, the procurement, most of the areas we look at, we're looking at contracts within those, because a lot of the activities we do, they're absolutely built into that. So it's that definition of where it sits and how it's covered. I take on board, if you did a mapping directly, I absolutely take on board your point. Council tax, single tax discounts, because I know I'm doing council tax now as we speak. Traditionally, that's a very strong, good system, and we've worked closely with NFI and follow on that. I know the risks in that area are lower. So for Shropshire Council, that impact isn't as high. If, as a result of the audit work that we're currently doing, that changes in any way, we will absolutely change that, and that's the fluidity of our plans, and that's the difficulty of it. So yes, and sometimes those national headlines that come out, it depends on the demography of where you are as a council as well, whether that impact is the same locally. So it's that mix and match. It's not necessarily direct mapping, but it's a valid question, and hopefully I've answered it.
Okay.
If I may, Kerry, do you think we'll ever get on top of bus pass fraud, which seems to be the one which costs us all the money, or the majority of most of our money?
Yeah, impossible one for me to answer. But
Somebody does their job properly, I assume it shouldn't be.
But what I would say is obviously the statistics and the value is based on a set amount per bus pass that's allocated to that type of fraud to give some estimate of a financial value. It may not necessarily reflect the financial value, because it's hard to say whether somebody may be deceased, but the bus pass may have been shredded and thrown away, but it just hasn't been reported back to us. So the numbers give an indication, but
It's not an actual loss.
It's not an actual
Okay,
loss.
thank you.
Yes.
Difficult to put a value on undetected fraud.
Just goes to show people are dying for a good public transport system in Berkshire, isn't it?
Nigel.
Kerry, I noticed the national report 8.2 says that the overall message is that you should have a dedicated counter-fraud team. However, we don't. I know you've alluded to this before, and certainly further on in the report, when you go on about, also when you mention staffing, that perhaps you're a small team and you can't really have a dedicated team. But are you confident that you can cover it as much as you should?
Yeah, I think not having a dedicated team doesn't mean that we haven't got the resources. Obviously, those resources, are limited, whether you have a team of identified specialists or not. We have done a review of that. It's in draft, so it wasn't ready to come to this committee, but I hope to report that in the future. What I would say is the challenge of dedicated teams as opposed to not. Sometimes those dedicated teams are looking for fraud, are looking for figures, whereas the way we work it is we're looking at, yes, that fraud's occurred, let's deal with it, but then what allowed it to occur, and let's put that right. So our motivation, and that's the discussion and the debate we've been having about whether the resources are in the right place. But we've got resources, not a dedicated team. We are absolutely always challenging that, and that, I'm justifying that to James, and I'm having a look at it through this pilot we've done, and I will be bringing that report back to you.
Thank you.
I always thought we had a dedicated team of one, and that is Katie Williams, who's with us today, one of Kerry's deputies, and reports at every meeting to us on the fraud investigations that are being carried out. So we may not have a multi-person team, but we've certainly got somebody who has spent some years dealing with fraud, and we are always grateful for your report and look forward to the one you're going to give us when we get to it later today, Katie. Thank you. Can we, we're invited to endorse with appropriate comment. Well, we've made lots of appropriate comment. Can we now have a short endorse? All in favour? All endorsed. Right, we've reached 11:35. Let us have a brief break to stretch our legs. I think in view of the length of the report, 5 minutes would probably do us. So 5 minutes comfort break. Oh.
The second part of the meeting, Mark.
I'm waiting for the signal. Oh.
He's on the phone.
Yeah, we're now live again, Chair.
Thank you very much. Now live to the attendant public. The next item is agenda item 10 on page 155, the annual review of audit committee terms of reference. And James Walton, our section 151 officer, will take us through this report. This is the committee terms of reference, not the members' terms of reference. Okay.
Thank you, Chair. So yes, this is the audit committee terms of reference, and so in line with best practice, we review the terms of reference on an annual basis. So that's set out in the attached appendix. As it says in the synopsis, there are no significant changes proposed. There are some changes. There are some changes of wording. There are a few areas of clarification that have been identified, and those have been updated, but we don't consider those to be significant in themselves. Where there are any changes, those are shown in italics, bold and underlined, just to try and make sure we use all of the tools available to us in Microsoft Word. So those are very clear in terms of what those changes are. It's an opportunity for audit committee to consider those terms of reference and suggest any of the changes or confirm that they are happy with them as they stand. There's, but actually, I'll leave it there. Thank you, Chair, and taking questions.
Any questions? Everybody happy? All agreed? Accept the report. Thank you. We now move to agenda item 11, audit committee self-assessment, which is on page 167. You'll all recall that you submitted to Kerry a personal assessment of what you felt confident about, what you were partly felt assured about, and what you had little confidence in your knowledge at that time. And from those reports, Kerry and James have put this self-assessment report together. So, James probably is first, and probably Kerry wants a word, I don't know. But we'll ask the section 151 officer, James Walton, to introduce the report.
Thank you, Chair. So this is the self-assessment for the current year. So there's really two parts of this. Appendix A and Appendix C set out within that self-assessment those areas of compliance with best practice, and identified within that in section 7.8 are the few areas that we have identified where there's partial compliance. So just to be clear, the self-assessment suggests that we have compliance with the audit committee has compliance with the vast majority of the parts identified, the good practice questions, and Appendix A sets out each of those areas in detail. There are just a few areas where we believe that there is partial compliance. On the back of that, there are a number of actions proposed in relation to those. So we can take each of those as necessary and go through any questions in relation to that. The second part then is around the action and training that's been provided in relation to the individual requirements of individual members of the audit committee. So Appendix B sets out that self-assessment in relation to training requirements. There is a section in 7.5 which sets out the training sessions that have been in place since May 2021. So there's quite a substantial list there, but as we go through the year, we'll pick up those other areas that are necessary. And Appendix B shows anonymised, but the individual responses that come back in relation to those best practice areas, and identified that in a number of areas there is a high level of confidence, where there are the majority of the committee are comfortable in relation to their knowledge and experience around those areas. There are some areas that are medium and some areas that are considered lower in relation to those requirements. So there's an action plan on the back of that to ensure that we've got the right training in place. But again, if there are any particular requirements that the committee would like to raise, we can discuss those and put in place appropriate action for the future. So I'll stop there, but the detail is there in Appendix A, B and C for consideration by the committee.
Kerry, do you want to add anything to that?
Not at this stage, Chair, thank you.
Well, considering that 3 members of the committee were not on the council prior to May last year, plainly, I would expect from the contributions that have been made today that they are becoming much more assured in their knowledge of audit and their ability to contribute to the important work of this committee. And I look forward to the self-assessment that will come in 2022 later this year, which will no doubt indicate that members are feeling more confident in their ability to contribute. There are a number of recommendations, 3.1, 3.2 and 3.3. All in favour? Thank you very much indeed. We now move to agenda item 12, which is on page 195, and is the draft audit committee work plan and future training requirements. We've already amended the training requirements twice, once by including cyber training and now by including more training on risk assurance. This is a constantly moving feast. Would you like to introduce this, Kerry?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. The report gives you the proposed work plan for the next 12 months and also the opportunity to feed into any training that's identified. It also explains the reasons behind some of the reports in the Appendix A, but probably the one that summarised is the second part of Appendix A. It gives you the dates against the matrices of what the reports are that are going to your audit committees, the timing of training, and also shows that there's a provisional date for audit committee as well on the 27th of October, in case it's required to close the statement of accounts. But what we're probably looking for from members at this point in time is if there's anything additional that should be added since providing this report. I have added in about the cloud report coming to your September committee, and as Chair's alluded to, training in terms of risk management. And there's something else that's gone out my head at the moment, sorry. But yes, I think there's a follow-up on treasury management as well from our internal staff that was requested by Chair following the last training. So if there's anything that you feel would be worth adding in at this stage, particularly around any areas where you're seeking assurance from managers and direct reports from them. It may be, Chair, that these things come out later as we start to talk about what audit's doing, what audit isn't doing, and it is one of those things that evolves over time, but this is the starting point for awareness. Thank you, Chair.
Yes, thank you, Kerry. Can I stress that this is just a draft, a working draft, basically, as we see training and development for the coming year, but it is subject right through the year to any requests from members for different subjects to be included in training, or an indication of anything they feel less confident about in terms of their knowledge of a particular audit requirement. So we're asked to accept this basically as a draft for the work for the coming year, capable of amendment as we go through. Any comment? So we're asked to approve with the appropriate comments that I've made, and all in favour? Thank you. Right, item 13, government assurance, internal audit quality assurance, external assessment outcomes 21-22. We're on pages 223 to 244 of the report, 223 to 244. James is going to, no, sorry. Yes, James is going to introduce this report for us.
Shall I pick this one up, Chair?
Sorry, yeah, I beg your pardon, I'm looking at the agenda, it says contact James Walton, but in fact, the responsible officer for the report is Kerry. Apologies, Kerry.
No problem. Thank you, Chair. Members will recall that once every 5 years, in compliance with our mandatory standards, we have to ask an independent assessor to come in and confirm if we're complying with the public sector internal audit standards and any areas of improvement. And this is the formal report coming back to you to recognise the outcome of that, which was a really good one, and reflects that the team is strong and complying with those SIRs. This is particularly important as well to our external clients who contract with us for work. It gives them a level of assurance independent of our annual self-assessment. I'm not going to go into any further detail than that, Chair, because I think the report sets it all out, and this is just the formal confirmation of what members are aware of. Thank you, Chair.
This is simply what we as a committee are going to consider during the course of this year, the coming year, from April the 1st through to March 2023.
13, item 13, Chair. I think you put it back to 12.
I did, yes, I beg your pardon. Thank you for that. It's been quite a long day. Right. Well, we've had the introduction. Any comments on the report? Yes, Nigel, please.
I thought this was a very good report, and I think it's very reassuring regard our internal audit team. I did note the comment that the consideration of smart analyzer to be taken up. I don't know the costings of that or the implications, but I saw that consideration is being given to it.
Thank you. Well, there is unsolicited testimonial. Thank you, Nigel.
Thank you. And if I may, Chair, we have considered Smart Analyzer. Katie and the team use IDEA, and some of the scripts we've got are written much more bespoke for what we need at Shropshire Council. So although it's available, if we bought it, we wouldn't get as much out of it as what we do actually internally. So we just needed that time to review to make sure that was the case. Thank you, Chair.
Any other comment? Everybody happy? We're asked again, I think, to endorse the report. All agreed? Thank you very much. Now we go to item 14. I'm quite clear on that. And item 14 is page 245 to 264, third line assurance, internal audit charter. Kerry again, please.
Thank you, Chair. The charter demonstrates how we comply with public sector internal audit standards. We use this when we go and speak to new clients and when we're engaging with people, but also to confirm how we're going to behave in that relationship. There's no significant changes since the last year, but it's the responsibility of your committee to consider this each year and ensure that it's being reviewed appropriately.
We've been working to this charter for a number of years. There's virtually no significant changes. Everybody happy with our charter? We're a chartered group of auditors. Right, all in favour? Yep, all indicating. Thank you. Item 15, third line assurance, internal audit performance report and revised annual audit plan. This is a very significant report. Pages 265 to 290. Our head of audit, Kerry Pulowski, again, please.
Thank you, Chair. Members will be familiar now with the types of performance report that this is. I will report that we have had impact from the ongoing impact of COVID flowing, which has changed our risks. And the report provides you with the work that we've delivered to date and highlights their assurance areas, giving you the opportunities to challenge those or seek further assurances from the managers if required. So changes to the planned activity reflect the impact of Omicron to Council's activities, which impacted from mid-December. Non-essential services were paused, and we've helped support some of the business grants coming through and providing some of the welfare grants as well. So the impact on resources for internal audit has to be adjusted for this. If I take members to the top of page 268, you've got the pie chart there of the planned audits, and there's assurance there that we're well into the work with what we've finalised, draft reports and work in progress. And you have good weeks and bad weeks. We've just had a good week where we're starting to clear quite a few of those draft reports as well. So I can report on that. The following chart demonstrates that we are covering the risks across all the directorates, so we can give a level of assurance across all, so that scope is covered. The table at the top of 269 is the key one for the work that we've done since reporting to you last. And it's good, always good to note where there's good and reasonable assurances provided. Those for members where you may want further information, I point to any area getting unsatisfactory or fundamental recommendation, but the details of these are provided further in the report. So the pie chart in 8.5 provides that split of assurances in more of a visual. In terms of fundamental recommendations, these are outlined from 8 to 10 downwards. The Brockton Primary School, whilst this is a repeat recommendation, and normally I would alert you to this, there has been a change of head at that school, and the discussions have been that they absolutely want to deal with this issue. So we have quite a high level of confidence that the management is signed up to do this. The Power Platform, the briefing note there, the responsibilities here, there's a footnote from the interim head of IT about the work that's been done on that to address the issues raised there. And the dog wardens, this is a repeat fundamental recommendation. What we're doing at the moment is we've just gone in to do a bit of a health check to see how they're doing in implementing the recommendations, but we'll do a true audit with an assurance next year on that, so we're supporting that team on improving their controls. I'm just looking to see if I need to bring your attention to anything else, but I think in terms of direction of travel, top of page 277, at this stage I'm getting close to the year end where I'll give an opinion on the internal control environment of the organisation, the governance and the way it manages its risks. And this just gives you a flavour of where it's positioning itself at this point in time in a visual. What I would say is the lower level assurances are lower than the outturn for 2021 at this point in time, which looks promising. The last quarter, we're always doing fundamental reviews, is the key systems in terms of financials and impact on the organisation. So they will have a significant weighting when they're completed as well. So obviously we just have to caveat it with that. But I'm happy to take any questions, Chair, and any of the details raised by the report. And Kate is here to help me as well.
If we look at 817, to which you've just been referring, some significant areas of risk in draft that may impact on this. I know you've had some difficulties with changes to the team and some of your people being drafted out to deal with COVID areas of risk and compliance. Have you now got a full staff back that you can hope to complete all the significant areas that you want to this financial year?
Yes, Chair, there's probably couple of aspects of that. In terms of the team and the resources, I'll pick that up as well in the planning for next year. We are going through recruitment. We are working through people that have resigned, and we're replenishing the team on that basis. In terms of the work to date this year, yeah, we've got resources and the plan. This was alluding to, when I wrote this report, we never report to you until we finalise the report, because we need to verify that information with the owner of that information. And we knew at the point of writing this report, there were some areas that may be landing perhaps in that unsatisfactory limited insurance that may change the direction of travel. But until we bottom them and we can absolutely report factually to you, we won't do that. So it's more that caveat that they're in draft because they're in that discussion between the management and the auditor, just to refine it and to ensure that they're accurate before we report them to the committee. Does that answer your question, Chair?
Yes, thank you very much, Kerry. Any other comments on this report? You wish to comment? Nigel? Councillor Lumbig?
I can't find where the particular bit is, but it was the Kia contract. Was that in this report? In relation to reassurance now that the systems were working correctly, it was accurate, it was being... the reason why I bring it up was if that's now the case and that's now not a high risk, if you remember, we deferred the head of highways to speak to us again about it for 6 months. If that's now been resolved, then we don't necessarily need them to come.
Through you, Chair, I think where you're referring to is the table in 280, and this is the Appendix and Audit opinions. And yes, you'll see there that the Highways Term Maintenance Care contract, we've done a review of this and it's limited. So it's not unsatisfactory, it's limited, it's moving in the right direction. And given the size of it, the contract, you can then decide whether you want a management update, because obviously you might want to have assurance that it's still moving in that direction, or you may be happy to park it there. That's totally within the members' remit. But at the moment, yes, it's on the cards, it's limited, and it's reporting back. Management are giving you assurance in the summer on that.
Yes, it was in the minutes actually of the previous meeting that we would have a report today, but because of all the complications of amalgamating effectively 2 agendas, the one for the council meeting in December and those to be provided today, that has been left on the drawing board. But I would hope that we can have a report from Kia's and our own staff on the Kia contract. Remember, the Kia contract still has years to run, so I would like to be reassured that all the problems, or some of the problems, have been ironed out and others are on the way to being agreed and settled. So I'm sure that we will want a report from Kia's. Hopefully we can fit it into the June meeting, since it was originally going to be today. But certainly we shall need another report sometime in the not far distant future. Any other comments? Can we agree to accept the report? All in favour? Thank you. Right. Now, this is the time when we hear from Katie Williams, who is our department expert on risk management, and reports to us, of course, as I mentioned earlier, on fraud and at every meeting. So welcome, Katie, to introduce the report, which is on pages 291 to 294.
Thank you, Chair. This report gives members an update on the recent internal audit review of risk management system. Pleased to report the overall control environment was assessed as reasonable, with minor control weaknesses identified. The focus of this review was on user compliance with the processes around operational and project risks, which was a slight deviation from the previous scope where we generally focused on the risk management team processes around how they manage risk across the organisation. The recommendation of this report is for the committee to consider and endorse with appropriate comment the findings from this review. As a bit of background, as part of the public sector internal audit standards, internal audit are required to evaluate the effectiveness and the contribution to the improvement of risk management processes. And to support the SIRS, the audit committee terms of reference include the requirement for you to review annually the adequacy of the council's risk management arrangements, and this report helps you do that. As I mentioned in the introduction, the current review differs slightly from previous audits, and the reason for this is during the COVID pandemic, the focus on the risk management team and insurance team shifted towards business continuity. However, they did continue with their business as usual activities during that time. So the audit set out to ascertain the processes around updating and reviewing operational risk registers and project risks being captured. This feeds into some of the questions earlier from Councillor Lumby around how that process is managed. So it's looking at how the opportunity risk management strategies are applied across the organisation and how those operational risk registers are considered and how that feeds up then through the project risk registers as well into the strategic risk reviews. At 6.4, there's a summary there of our opinion. Based on the audit work undertaken, the processes were assessed as reasonable. Draw members' attention to paragraph 6.6 in the table beneath it. That sets out the scope of our audit with the objectives we reviewed and a summary of our findings. So you can see control 1, the robust system for the identification and recording of risk. We assessed that as being partially achieved, and the main reason for that was around the operational risk registers. We identified instances where risk registers required updating following the impact of COVID. The other thing to assure members on is we do routinely review risk registers as part of all of our audits to make sure that we're capturing the risks the service have identified and any arising from our audit that we think they also need to consider. Happy to take any questions if anyone has any arising from the report.
Well, we want to make you happy, Katie. Has anybody got any questions? Simon.
Yeah,
Councillor Harris.
it's just a quick one. Operational risk registers. I'm not familiar with that. I mean, is that a grid or is it a what is it?
We use a standard format across all the departments, and they're maintained within SharePoint. And the team are working at the moment on developing some of the reporting mechanisms for that. So each service area would maintain a spreadsheet with their risks. I think probably this will be something that Angie might pick out at the training around what those risk registers look like. Each of those has the likelihood, the impact, the mitigating controls and a target implementation date. What the team are currently working on so is a Power BI reporting tool to identify common themes across the operational risk registers that might need to feed up into the strategic risk review.
No, that's great. Thank you very much.
Shall we again use our endorsing powers, members? All agreed? Thank you, Katie. We now move to agenda item 17, internal audit plan 2022 to 23 to be introduced by the head of audit, Kerry Pulaski.
Thank you, Chair. This is our proposal for the 22-23 plan going forwards. Like any plan, it's based on current risks, resources, and it needs to stay fluid and respond flexibly to the council's needs and those of our external clients. What I've done is I've set out the plan's allocations in Appendix A, and then Appendix B is a list of high-risk areas that aren't in the plan at the moment. They're not allocated, but we'll have a contingency of resources that we match to those high-risk areas on a priority basis. And then Appendix C identifies areas that we won't have the resources to look at. We consider them low risk. And the reason for highlighting that is if any members feel that any of those areas should be a higher risk, then there's an opportunity there to have that conversation. In popping the plan together, I have to ensure that I cover governance processes, ethics, IT, risk management and fraud management. There's a whole process behind this where there's discussions with the chief executive, the executive directors, their assistant directors and heads of service, whole consultation process. I also refer to all the strategic risks, have regular meetings with the risk managers, and also I call upon the information that we provide here throughout the year and the wider business, what's going on through cabinet and council. Also have regular meetings with James, the section 151 officer, the monitoring officer, and we're discussing risks on that. So there's information coming up all the time to inform this. On top of that, we look at national information. So I pick up on what the top risks are facing councils and see how they apply to our council and evaluate that as well. And also as a member of the peer groups across different councils and public sector, we discuss the risks. So this then formulates the plan, and the split of that plan you can see at the top of 299 that there's a rough split around assurances, advice we give. We do work in schools, education, IT key because of all the reliance on that. We do quite a chunk now on external contracts, which brings in income that funds the Shropshire work as well. The counter fraud activity contracts. What's difficult when you pop anything in a category, you might have something in a contract that might also hit a procurement button, that might also hit a management control button. So it's like anything when you display this. Difference this year, there's a much bigger contingency. I've changed the approach. And the reason for this is I've probably had about 25-30% turnover in this team. And we know that's coming at the point in time that I wrote this. I've got resignations of 2 full-time and a part-time auditor. So we're recruiting. We don't know whether we're going to be able to recruit somebody that's fully qualified or somebody that's on that journey. So if I put audits in the plan that don't match those skills, I'll be revising it all the time. So I've designed the plan on my knowns at this point in time in terms of the business risks and the skill set of the auditors that I know that are in place. And as those new resources are available to me, I'll be able to call up and pop their plans in place. So that's what I'm trying to do, and that's why I've changed it a little bit. I think the other thing to note is in the ideal world, based on risk, if you gave me 3,700 days, I could just about look at all your high level risk areas. Just about, because things change and things always ping in the email box. So it would take us about 4 years on the current resources to cover all that. That's not unusual. You can't do everything, and that's why you prioritise it. So that question of do you have enough resources? Never enough, but we can manage with what we've got and we can prioritise. And I feel I can give you an opinion at the year end based on the resources I've got. Fingers crossed, if we can recruit and attract the right calibre of people. So what you're looking for is assurance that the resources are there, we can get the right people. We've still got that mix of resource across the team, even with the resignations, because we've multi-skilled people. We're not losing any clear area that I'm going to have to say I absolutely need to buy in, or we haven't got the internal skills to do that. So I'm satisfied we've looked at the resources, how we plan. I'm satisfied we've looked at the business needs, and as a result, there's the plan. It will change. April 1st, it will change. It's changed as we put it on paper now. It attempts to pick up all those areas and revisit them that have been given unsatisfactory assurance. Anything with a fundamental recommendation, we follow up. Might just follow up that recommendation. We might follow up the whole area if it sits in an area that's got a much larger, weaker controlled environment. IT, absolutely key. I've got a really clear assessment on the IT work, and that's well supported. And we also have somebody that works on a casual contract for me that helps underpin that as well. I expect there will be a little bit of delay from COVID. There's a lag, and what I mean by that, I've got auditors that will come back into the business that will pick up audits, but also the business areas are picking up. There's backlog. So for them to have auditors, sometimes the pressure of an audit impacts on the systems aren't as slick as they could be. That takes a bit longer to review and things like that. I have reduced my counter fraud contingency to accommodate how I need to plan this year. I've done that based on what we know at the moment, that demand is slightly lower at the moment. Is it a risk? Yes. Is it a managed risk? Yes. If something comes in tomorrow, even with today's resources, if it's a major fraud, we look at that and the planned work gets parked for a short while we look at it, the period of time, and we evaluate whether we need to buy in resources to satisfy the assurance need to give. So it is balancing everything that we will do all the time. We continue to make sure that we cover our risk-related scores as well as staff assessments, and we look at the documents that schools complete on an annual basis. SPFS stands for
Schools Financial Value Standard.
Yes. So we look for those, and they're signed up by governors and head teachers, and they give us assurances. So it's designed to allow for appropriate coverage. It's aligned to the mandatory requirements, so I can give you assurance on that. It's flexible enough to change to the risk of the environment. It's not set in stone. And also through these meetings, if things bubble up, we can adjust things as well. So that's the background behind it. So hopefully you're comfortable it's as robust as it can be processed. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Kerry. Questions? Everybody happy? Can I simply say that I am always staggered, having worked with you for 10 years or more, you've been with us, just how much you and your team manage to cover every year with very limited resources. It is a very small team, diminished, as Kerry has said, from time to time by changes, and we've had innumerable maternity leaves during the course of the, not you and I, but during the course of that 10 years and so on. You have my admiration for what you and your team achieve. All able to endorse the report?
Questions?
Oh, sorry, you're all putting your hands up for questions. I thought,
Yeah.
oh dear. Right, Rosemary first. Councillor Dartmouth.
Thank you. Just a minor thing, Kerry, the sort of unfortunate coincidence of staff going at the same time in a small team, is that standard turnover of staff and just unfortunate happening together, or is it part of the nature of this kind of work being, as you say, very much on a journey of training, really, I guess?
There's always a regular turnover, because what we do is we do give the opportunity to train. I'd rather have somebody training with us for 3 years and getting a real positive interaction and risk losing them if they get promotions or if they get a skill set to go elsewhere, and not give them that opportunity. So we do have that. I think with the changes in ways of working, people have seen different opportunities come up and arise, and are taking those opportunities. They're reassessing what they want out of life. And I think also internal audit is quite a tough job to do on a long-term basis, because it's constantly challenging, and we're doing it for the right reasons, but sometimes that can have quite a heavy impact on people. So I think there's lots of different reasons people are giving me for making those moves, but they're all making moves with skills that they've got to really strong for the next job, and some of those are within the council. They're just not internal audit, so it's a mix.
We're going around clockwise rather than members, so it's Councillor Lumby next. Nigel.
Chair, I got the same question, so I'm happy with the answer.
Oh, good, thank you. Councillor Evans. Roger.
Along the same lines, Chairman, but also I noted 7.8, and the word recruitment is planned. Is that still in the future or no? Because I congratulate you and your staff on the amount of work that you do,
Thank you.
And I would want to ensure that you do have sufficient staff there. So all I'm seeking is assurances that you are not being delayed by other external problems in filling those vacancies, and they are going ahead as much as possible, I suppose.
Yeah, at the time of writing the report, I was aware of the resignations. I hadn't pressed the button, I hadn't received all the information, but the advert's out. So if you know anybody that would like to join the internal audit and has got those skill set, please point them in that direction. The advert's out, it closes towards the end of the month, and hopefully we'll have strong candidates. We don't know what the market is until obviously we get those applications in.
Thank you. Simon, Councillor Harris.
Yes, thank you, sir. So you've gone clockwise. Thank you for giving us that update on those 3,000 days. We're down to a third of that, and so it's really commendable the amount that you get through. I presume with the same level of thoroughness. And I suppose, do you know how we compare with other similar local authorities? From an audit perspective, are we under or over resourced, or are we? How are we doing? I'd hate to think that you were under resourced, because that makes us look a bit weak as a committee, if that is the case.
It's an interesting question, and it's a difficult one. We used to do benchmarking. Probably 5-6 years ago, you could do that. What's hard today is people have so many different multiple roles. You don't always get pure resources that you can compare with. And the other thing is, because we don't audit processes for process sake, we audit on risk. The risk of our authority as a unitary may be different to the risks of another authority. So it depends on how much commercial activity we've got, how much business as normal, changing systems, management changes. And so it's about that. That's where the professional viewpoint and the justification and how is this all put together and thought through. So there's that aspect of it. Yes, absolutely. Talk to peers. We occasionally discuss numbers, structures, and things like that. And my present position is I think we're okay. It's one of those things you don't know unless you go into the detail of what those people are doing and the quality. But in terms of quality, when you say your numbers are reduced, hopefully to the same level of quality, absolutely yes, and that's why you've had the independent assurance. So that's telling you yes, what we're churning out is the appropriate quality. But yes, it's tight, and the thing for the audit committee to consider is if these reports come through and I need to say to you, I can't cover that area, I can't give assurance on that area, because I haven't got the resources to do. That's when you need to say, okay, well, either we resource internal audit more, or where else can we get that assurance from? So there's always those other options as well.
Thank you, sir.
Right, shall we accept Kerry's internal audit plan for 2020-23, subject to any changes that may need to be made as she has outlined to us? To accept. Thank you very much indeed. Now we move to agenda item 18, which says that the responsible officer is James Walton, but the report will be given in his usual focused and succinct manner by Grant Patterson, our external auditor. Do you want to introduce this first, James?
No, I'm fine to go straight over to Grant, Chair. Thank you.
Okay, Grant, welcome. You've waited patiently through our other deliberations. It's a pleasure to have our external auditor with us.
Right, thank you, Chair. I'm also joined by Mary Wren today as your audit manager. Mary's actually on holiday, so if her connection is a little bit weak, then let us know. But she's called in just for this progress report. So in terms of that, what you have in front of you today is a progress report from us in relation to the 2021 audit and an update on some of the work around certification. So I'm going to take you straight to page 316. Where in terms of progress from the last time we met with the committee, if members remember, we highlighted we were looking at some areas around property, plant and equipment, specifically around gross internal areas which do drive valuations. Through working with the council and officers and our testing, we have identified 4 assets in terms of information provided to the value that were not accurate, and as a result of that, the council is proposing an adjustment to its financial statements of £12.1 million in relation to that. And as members are aware, that we also sample test, so adjustments made for those 4 specific assets, but when we extrapolate that potential error, there's a further £4.5 million, which is a potential misstatement. So it's not material once the adjustment has been made, but we will be reporting back to you in our audit findings report in terms of valuations of the assets. I think from members' perspective, in terms of whilst the valuation of assets will be going down, I think in terms of the way that the council manages its asset base, etc., that's not necessarily a direct implication of you losing money per se. It's a valuation basis, and any changes in valuation will only be realised should you actually dispose of the assets. So it's really just giving a true and fair view of the total assets that the council is managing. In terms of other areas of the accounts that we've talked to you about in progress, one of them around operating expenditure, and particularly around the social services expenditure, which is primarily administered through Controc, which is a system which relies on another subject called Liquid Logic, which helps the caseload. And it's about £125 million goes through that system. We were struggling with getting what we would consider the appropriate reasonable audit evidence. We were comfortable that the information that was in Controc, because of the work that actually Kerry and her team had done, and then getting into the ledger was fine. But under auditing standards and our regulator, we need to get back to sort of original documentation, and primarily I think for Controc that was getting back to contracts and then understanding the care packages in place. Mary did meet specifically with the Controc team last week, and as a result of that, actually, prior to that, we were trying to work through finance, and we just felt it was better in a way just to go straight to the team. And Mary, having done that, we now believe we've got a way forward, and I understand that today the relevant information should be being posted onto our system for us to review. So I think when we wrote this, we were concerned that we weren't getting the evidence. We're hopefully, now that we've got through that impasse, as I say, because of annual leave commitments, we will look at that next week, and as long as that is in place, then hopefully we will be able to draw that part of the audit to a conclusion, and therefore that will be the 2 main bits of the audits complete. In terms of exit packages, we're still finalising some areas around that, and the council has provided much more detailed note for us to review, and that's more around the decision making process, not the numbers per se, and we will be taking that forward in the next week as well. So I think in that sense, and taking 317, we're then in the sort of final stages of looking at the audit. At the moment, I'm still proposing an unqualified opinion, and hopefully, I say, setting a timeline. If the evidence comes through next week, then hopefully in the next couple of weeks we're in a position to come back to you with an updated audit findings report. We did think about bringing one to this meeting, but there's a danger that if we brought one, we'd then need to bring another one if there are any subsequent changes. So we will provide an updated audit findings report to you to support that. So I know it's taken longer than we wanted, but we are now getting closer to being able to issue the opinion on the financial statements. So that's where we're on the financial statements audit. Just in relation to value for money, the work is going on sort of parallel to this, but clearly we can focus on the financial statements. What we are required to do is issue our annual auditor's report within 3 months of issuing the opinion. We will look to get that done quicker than that, but to say that work is in progress and will be delivered at the same time. And then just quickly, I won't spend too long on page 318, which basically is just a reminder of the work we're doing on grant claims. We have signed off your housing benefit return for this year, and work is still in progress on teachers' pensions and pooled housing capital receipts, where we're working with the finance team to get the final bits of information so that we can sign those off. So again, hopefully those will be resolved in the next couple of weeks. I don't think there's any financial implications for the slight delays in those on the council. I won't go into audit fees. I'm sure we've spoken about those regularly, but we will coming back to you when we plan our 21-22 audit in relation to those. 319 is really just summarise what I've taken you through. and then probably just into the next bit on sector update. I wasn't going to go through that in detail. I think interestingly, picking up on some of the conversations you've been having, I suppose on 322 might be the one that you might the council, is that there's changes around the minimum revenue provision, which links into borrowing, and especially if you give that to external bodies. So that might be something, depending on where the department lands, that might have a potential impact upon the council, depending on how the borrowing is undertaken, especially when you on-lend it, I suppose, in a way to some of your subsidiary companies, etc., depending on the nature of those. But we're still awaiting the department's final comeback on what it wishes to happen. Its concerns there around more around investment properties. So I was going to stop there, and unless Mary's got anything to add to that, and happy to take questions.
Does Mary have anything to add to that?
No, I was just going to follow up on Grant's comment that while we've been in the meeting, I have been receiving information from Nikki around contracts. So as I said, when we look through that next week, we hope to bring that information to a close.
Thank you. Well, we shall certainly welcome an unqualified opinion on our financial statements that I hope you will be able to give. But in the meanwhile, questions. Roger, please. Councillor Evans.
Thank you, Chairman. I note the comment about the last bullet point on page 316. I note that in the report that I've seen, there were some high value exit packages, and be interested to see any comments that are made on those in it. And also in the minimum revenue provision, if I read correctly, there's a report in the media today that one council has decided to alter its position on the minimum revenue position, and is costing the council some money. But I'd be interested to see what you say about that in your report. Thank you, Chairman.
Is there any comment on that at this moment of time?
Chair, I won't comment on the exit packages. We'll pick that up as part of the audit finding report. In relation to minimum revenue provision, currently when we've looked at your policies, and I think where the member is coming from about that is, there's whether you charge minimum revenue provision generally, I think is where the sector is concerned about, or where the government is concerned about, is where you do loans to maybe to companies generally, or to third parties who are then doing investment properties. And the argument being that if they make a return, you don't have to put minimum revenue provision aside, you'll get a capital receipt that will cover the loan. I think in terms of prudence, the government, the consultation is suggesting or requiring you that you should put MRP. I don't think the council is in that position, but I will in that it hasn't in its way it's done its policy, but we will pick that up as part of our final reporting. But again, it's what might happen if those regulations go through. They won't kick in until April 23, but we are waiting to see what the final decision is. I think picking up on that point, the council has generally been prudent with its MRP approach. I think some other councils, as the member has alluded to, have maybe been more aggressive in that sense. As I say, there's big debate around whether a capital receipt can be used to repay the loan. The current view, or government's view, is it doesn't wish that to happen, but it is consulting because I know there's a lot of conversation going on in the sector around unforeseen implications, or of what the change might be, especially where you've got well-run companies which are doing well and elements like that. So I don't think the council is there yet, but clearly that's something that it will have to take into consideration in any future sort of investment decisions.
Thank you. Councillor Harris. Simon.
Yeah, sorry, I'm new to this. The accounts, I presume, closed sort of April, end of March, basically 22. How long would you normally expect to complete your audit? Because we're nearly a year into the space now. That might be normal. I just don't know. But what do you?
No. Sorry, Councillor. Yeah, it's not normal, and I think a lot of it's been driven by the pandemic. I mean, in general terms, in terms of how long an audit would take, the process with the normal one with what, 4 or 5 months in elapsed time maximum. I think we'd probably be looking to do an audit, council of your size, in a couple of months generally. I think if in sort of pre-pandemic circumstances. I think working remotely has proved challenges both for us as auditors and I suppose from the council as well, in terms of getting information together. In terms of where we are, we have a number of councils which we haven't let sign off 2021, and the other firms have the same backlogs as well, and we are resolving to get that through. What the government has done effectively, I think, to recognise that is next year, 21-22, it's proposed, or hoping that the publication date for audited accounts will be the end of November for this year, effectively. It hasn't said on 2022-23, but for 23-24, it's looking to get that date back into having published audited accounts by the end of September. So the audits which should come back into being more in line with that going forward. So this is an extended version, but I will say you're not alone, and I'm even aware there are some councils that haven't even yet produced their 2021 accounts yet. So it's sort of across the sector. I think the pandemic has had those sort of impacts upon various parts and prioritisation for councils. So it's not ideal where we are with yourselves. We recognise that, but we have been working through. So and as I say, hopefully we can draw it to a conclusion in the next couple of weeks.
Okay, thanks. That's well, I mean, hopefully encouraging for the future.
Right, so no more further questions. Shall we accept Grant's report with thanks? The report of our external auditors, Grant Thornton. All agreed? Thank you. Thank you, Grant.
Thank you, Chair. I might have to drop off the call now if that's okay, but Mary might be able to hang on for a little bit.
Nothing else on the agenda that requires your
Okay. Thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you. The item 19, the next meeting of the Audit Committee will be held on 30th of June. I intend to have discussions with Kerry and James about a meeting before the 30th of June, simply because that is nearly 4 months ahead, and it will be an exceptionally long agenda, particularly if we're going to have a report about the care contract and seek assurance on that. And there are other issues. I'd like to try and balance the amount of work between two committees rather than put it all on the 30th of June committee. So there will be a committee on the 30th of June, but there may be another one prior to that when I've had suitable discussions. Shall we now resolve that in accordance with the provision of the law in relation to the Council's access to information rules, the public and press be excluded during consideration of the following items? Shall we so resolve? Agreed. Yes, I've got that. I'm waiting for the clerk to assure me that the public and press have been